Our first speaker for this morning is a name that we all know and someone we've all heard, but it mightn't be a face that we've all necessarily seen because he's most famous probably for some of his radio spots. And it's Karl Faase, and he's going to be coming to speak to us about why it is that Christians struggle to face the tough issues. Karl has been a Baptist pastor for more than 20 years. He's now the director of Olive Tree Media, which has programs on Christian radio and television across Australia and internationally. Karl is known for his Daily Nudge radio spots, played daily on most Christian radio stations nationally. Karl sits on several boards, including Samaritan's Purse, Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, Christian Television Australia, and Sydney Prayer Breakfast and Southern Community Welfare. Karl is married to Jane, and they have 3 married children and 2 grandchildren. Please join me in welcoming Karl for his presentation.
The Christian church and Christian faith is being questioned across the Western world. The church is believed to be dying, obsolete, as well as allowing the abuse of children to go unchecked. Christian faith is attacked as lacking intellectual or logical foundation. In response to these challenges, we have created a new series, Towards Belief. Join us as we take you on a journey to speak with Christian thinkers as they diffuse the belief blockers of our time.
The real battle or conflict, as I see it, is not between science and belief in God, it's between 2 worldviews.
You know, we're really disappointed when we see leaders do terrible things.
I see my work on this topic as an ode to doubt.
I felt the greatest tragedy would be to take the most important message in the world and make it boring and irrelevant to people.
You hear all of the time, well, how can you say that one way has the truth? There's so many different religions. They all claim a path to God.
The Anglican Church in the Diocese of London has gone up 70% since 1996. So this is the growth that is happening. People think the church is declining, but it's not.
And yet many people across the world actually find the Bible really hard to deal with. We talk with some of the best Christian minds and apologists across the globe to give those with serious philosophical questions responses that have both academic rigour and accessible information. The Church of London has come together to praise God and to pray for a nation. Towards Belief is designed for the average person with material that will address commonly held views about Christian faith and belief. The series closes with an opportunity for the viewer to make a response to all they have seen and heard. This series will help the viewer grapple with the blockers to belief and provide the opportunity to take a fresh look at Christian faith. We wanted to begin just by letting you know about the series that we've just released last year that's being shown across the world, and it's an outstanding series. It's a 10-part series, 28 minutes. It's being used by churches across Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the UK and the US as well. It's an opportunity to respond to the belief blockers of our time, and we speak to 31 Christian leaders, thinkers, academics across the world, and I think you'll find it incredibly helpful for your church. You want to respond to what blocks people from Christian faith, and they're available today. I want to thank Lyle for the invitation, for Tony and Ray McClellan and special guests, and the opportunity to talk to you this morning. Part of it came out of an article I'd written in Eternity magazine, and Lyle asked if I would speak on that this morning, which is this whole question about why the evangelical church in Australia, in particular issues, most specifically around same-sex marriage, why it's painfully silent. And in a number of places, almost reticent to take a step forward to make a response. Now, this is kind of odd, really, because the Bible is very clear in numbers of issues, and certainly clear on that issue. And so for those who believe the Bible, are strong on what God's word would say, why would they be so silent? And I wanted to respond to that and kind of say, so how do we speak into the tough issues of our community? And try and do that in 20 minutes, punctuated by a bell, probably twice. There's 3 key issues, and the first is the shift from word to deed. In 1974, there was a Lausanne Congress that Billy Graham brought together in, surprisingly, Lausanne, Switzerland, and it was really because the World Council of Churches had decided that maybe at that period of time it would be good to have a moratorium on mission. And Billy Graham believed that we needed to stay with talking about the gospel, the word, the message of Jesus as clearly as we possibly could. He gathered leaders from across the world, including leaders from Australia. Some very key leaders went, like Bishop Jack Dane, who actually helped sit beside John Stott, and they wrote what was then called the Lausanne Covenant. The Lausanne Covenant became very important because it was a statement of belief for the evangelical church committed to the word, gospel as word across the world. Now, Australians had a lot of impact into that statement, not just because Jack Dane and others were involved, but because there were a number of leaders that came from Australia who were very vocal about what they saw as the problem with the Lausanne Covenant. Because the first draft on the Lausanne Covenant was very soft on deed. It had almost nothing. I wasn't there. I wasn't actually still in high school, in fact, but was told that it just didn't have enough about gospel as deed. And I only bring that story up because it sort of makes a point about the fact that across the world at that time, and it went for the next 20 years, there's a bit of a tussle within the evangelical church where there were those who were saying, why would we allow those who we feed to go to a godless eternity if we don't bring Jesus into their lives? Others were saying, how can you possibly share the message of Jesus without feeding people who are starving to death? Now, that's putting it in very bold, that wasn't the bell, was it? In very bold terms. Now, interestingly, what happened was over the years, that argument has gone to and fro, but in the end, as it were, deed has won. And right now in Australia, you go to almost any church across Australia, and they'll be active in gospel as deed. And that's a good thing. I don't want you to hear me say that that's a bad thing. That is a good thing. And the key is, in the midst of all of that justice became really important. Being standing up for those who are marginalised, standing up for those who are voiceless, as it was spoken about last night, standing up for those who had no power. And the word justice in the midst of deed for the gospel became a really important word. Keep that in mind. The second thing is the shift from focusing on kind of holiness and eternity to focusing on love and grace. If you go back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, holiness and eternity were really important words for the evangelical church. Certainly people like Billy Graham, who I mentioned before, who took tent revival meetings in Southern American states and made them national, international crusades in major cities. And to do those, you called people to make a response there and then. And when you call people to make a response, you remind them of what is at stake, their eternal destiny. And so eternity became incredibly important. We know in Australia that the great Baptist preacher, there you go, I've got Baptist in tonight, this morning, the great Baptist preacher John Ridley, who in the 1950s and 60s, early 70s, was a great preacher across Australia. Very interesting character. And he was preaching in Belvoir Street Baptist Church when a young semi-literate man who'd been an alcoholic who'd come to faith in Sabani's Broadway heard John Ridley say in his booming voice, I wish eternity would echo across the streets and lanes of Sydney. And he took that as a word from God into his life and proceeded to write eternity on the streets of Sydney more than 400,000 times in the next number of years. Most of those times he did it anonymously. His name was Arthur Stace. And when the millennium turned in Sydney and the lights, it was lit up, what was lit up across the Sydney Harbour Bridge? Eternity. It was actually a reflection of what the heart of the church was. But there was a negative side to that, because if you constantly preach eternity and your eternal destination, what are you constantly preaching? Often judgment and sin and death. And for many people growing up in the church at that time, that was just kind of almost taking the most negative part of the gospel message and dumping it onto people. And it was done for the best motivation, and that is to get people to respond. The negative is that it was always crushing people, as it were. And into all of that came this shift into love and grace. And that's probably epitomised most by Philip Yancey's book, What's So Amazing About Grace. And if you remember Philip Yancey's book, which has been out for a long time and very well known, one of the things he starts with is a story about a prostitute who had done awful things in her life. And all this terrible stuff was happening, and she'd behaved badly. And somebody said to her, why don't you go to church? And she said, I never go to church. I already feel bad enough about myself. Now really, we ought to be the dispenser of grace, oughtn't we? We ought to be the place that you would run to. But if we preach judgment only, people aren't going to come. And so grace and love, next to justice, became really key words for young evangelicals growing up across the world, but really if I'm just referring to Australia. And the third is the whole want to be contemporary, want to kind of connect. When I first worked in Baptist churches, I used to joke that Baptists would wake up every Sunday morning and pray it was 1950 again. And when you turned up to church, it looked like it was. And it was really because they were trying to hang on to something that was really important. Baptists, in the 1959 Billy Graham Crusades across Australia, Baptists were very involved in making that happen. And when it was ended, and by the way, it's one of the closest things Australia's ever seen to revival, at the end of it, Baptists actually got the largest number of referrals out of that crusade. Now, they were incredibly active, but they held on to the form of church at that period of time. And so again, there's a whole generation of people growing up just desperate to be contemporary, desperate to relate to their community, desperate to connect into people's lives. Now I want to say that had some negative side effects across the world, but here was a positive motivation. So you can see here's these shifts. The shift into deed and justice being important. The shift from looking at eternity and holiness to looking at grace and love. The shift into being as contemporary and relevant and connecting as much as possible. And into those three things comes the same-sex debate and the gay lobby that says we love. And if you don't agree with what we say, you're not being loving to us. It is unjust that we are not allowed to be married like everybody else. You are on the wrong side of history, and everybody goes to water. It happens because of fabulous motivation. Those things, love and grace, justice and being relevant, have become key words for the evangelical church, and they're the hot buttons that are being pressed. And across Australia, key Christian leaders are backing off this argument because they just cannot bring themselves to be seen as somehow unjust, as seen as somehow unloving, or seen as, gosh, we could not be on the wrong side of history. Now, you and I, we're all here. We know that's all spin. But it doesn't feel like that when you're 23 in a local church disagreeing with every one of your friends. And so here is this space that the church finds itself in. And so how do we speak into tough questions? How do we be the voice of God? And you as a group, the reason you're here is you're committed to it, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir. You're not dressed like a choir, we're not singing, but I'm feeling like this is the choir. But I want to remind you of some of the great truths that we hold to. Quickly, in fact. First, how do we respond? Well, we've got to remain a prophetic voice in morality and justice. Key. We need to be a prophetic voice into morality and justice. I had a social media interaction with somebody who had a different view to me on some of this and basically said this to me. When you speak on justice, you represent Jesus. When you speak on morality, you represent the Pharisees. Now, that is completely wrong. Have you not read Matthew chapter 5 to 7? It's called the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus' statements on morality and things like marriage and divorce and hating your brother and murder and oaths would basically seem to us to be over-the-top moral positions. Jesus taught on both of those. He met people at their worst place, but he didn't leave them there, and he didn't ask them not to change. Love did not come as a values-free zone for Jesus, and nor should it be for us. We need to be voices, and I believe ACL is a voice for morality and a voice for justice. Secondly, we've got to remember that tone is crucial. We will be judged not necessarily by the words that we use, but the tone that we use. And there are places where the church, I'm not saying ACL, not so much in the Australian church, but there are places in the church where it's come across as negative, judgmental, and that's hurtful, and we ought to be repentant of it. Not hurtful because we disagree with people, but because we have a bad tone. Do you know why doctors get sued? You probably think doctors get sued because they make mistakes. Almost all doctors, except Gary Franks, who's with us this morning, all doctors make mistakes. They did research. One of the great writers I love, Malcolm Gladwell, has written about it in a book called Blink. And the end result is this. The difference between the doctors that got sued and the doctors that didn't get sued was A, a small amount of extra time, very small, and B, tone. You don't sue people you like. Here's the issue. We need to be cautious constantly about tone. The vitriol that has been brought against this hotel because of this conference demonstrates a very poor tone. We oughtn't respond in the same tone. We ought to be repentant of bad tone. Thirdly, be contemporary, but don't simply fall for being popular. We need to be contemporary in all that we do, but our problem is trying to be popular. Back in the 60s and 70s, the church in America faced this enormously with the sexual revolution. I could spend the 20 minutes talking about all of this. I'll repent of that thought and move on. Here's the deal. Doug Douthart has written a brilliant book called Bad Religion. He writes it, he's an op-ed writer for the New York Times. He writes as a secular journalist, although I think he's a Christian. He looks at the kind of decline of church attendance in America from 1950 through to the present time. And he looks at the period of time after the sexual revolution and the Vietnam War and the pill and all of that. And there were certain churches that decided that the church's view on sexuality was way too tight. Does that sound familiar? And that what the church needs to do is find a way to relate to the community in a way that they can kind of have the morality they like and still have spirituality or still have a form of religion, a la Alain de Botton's book, Religion for Atheists. It's almost like rip the heart out of belief, but give them an opportunity to get together, and voila, everyone would turn up. Now, logically, that sounds like it would work. You know what happened in the end? Prodigious decline of those denominations. Let me read him. Liberal Protestants are selling exactly what the accommodationalists claim the public so desperately wanted from religion, but no one was buying it. You know why? Because people wanted transcendence. They wanted a relationship with a transcendent God. He goes on to say this: they mistakenly associated sexual liberation, theological relativism, and growing prosperity with straightforward secularization, and assumed that what post-1960s America wanted from religion was something rational, non-mystical, anti-supernatural. And in the end, it's not what they wanted. And they left in their thousands. Being popular is not the answer. We need to relate in a contemporary mode, but don't just try and be popular. There's so much more we could say about that. We need to call the church to the Bible, but we call to society to human flourishing. And we know that. You know that. I don't know that our job is to call Australia to biblical morality to the dot of the Bible. That's not our job. But I tell you what our job is. Our job is to speak into the Australian community, to say, as was spoken last night, human flourishing. The Bible has something to say about that, and we want to be strong on that. And I want to move on to say this, that we have a historical, sociological, demographical and philosophical right to be at the heartland, the centre of the discussion within our community. And we should not buy the myth that because we have a spiritual religious background that somehow we're outside it, some small splinter group without a voice. Here, let me give you a few things. This nation was built on a Christian foundation. Whether people like it today or not, our values, that's where it came from. For the West, that's where our value came from. Historically, we have a right in this place. Do you know that in the census, 61% of Australians still tick the Christian box? Now think about that. If you add all other religions together, we are still 7 times all other religions. The next greatest is no religion at all, which is still just 22%. So Australians basically relate to faith and church. Now, yeah, they don't go to church, but they certainly relate to what we're saying. You know that we look at our football, our sport, our love of sport, and we look at our football and how many people turn up. If you combine everybody that turns up to AFL, NRL and soccer games in a month, McCrindle research says if you add them all up in a kind of over a month, 1.6 million Australians turn up to sporting fixtures. Do you know in a month in churches there are 3.4 million Australians? Do you know that across Australia right now, McNair research is saying that 3.3 million Australians listen to Christian radio on a monthly basis? 3.3 million Australians. In 1980, no. In 1980 there were There's something, check that girl's watch. In 1980, there were 2 Christian radio stations. Today, there are 42, plus 500 feeder stations in regional areas. The greatest growth in schooling has been the growth in Christian schooling. Between 1984, 12% to 28% in 2014, research done by Jennifer Buckingham. Do I need to go on? 4 out of the biggest 5 charities that raised funds in 2011, 12 and 13 were Christian-based charities. Out of the 25 biggest charities and not-for-profits in Australia right now, 23 of them are faith-based. We have a place at the table. We have a place in the community. And yet, we oughtn't be afraid of the margins, because the margins is where the church has grown the greatest. We don't demand a place at the table. We have a right to it. We don't demand it, and we're not afraid of the margins, because the earliest church started on the margins. Tiny splinter group coming out of a small place in the back blocks of an empire, and with 300 years became the religion of the empire. That was the power of the Spirit of God. China, the church was kicked out in 1950. And when China opened up again in the 1970s, they wondered what they would find left of the church. No Western leaders or missionaries allowed. And it's exploded. They're saying that Chinese will be the biggest ethnic gathering of Christians anywhere in the world in the next few years. Somewhere between 100 and 150 million Chinese are Christians. It grew in the darkness, in weakness, and at the margins. We don't demand a place at the table because we're somehow powerful that we should have it. We should be in there with a voice, and we should be unapologetic about that. But let's not go through life afraid of the margins, because that may be where God wants us. Thanks.
What we'll do now, of course, is just throw it open to Q&A. We'll be brief, just because we're mindful of time, so we'll probably only have time for just a small number of questions. If you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and I'll point you out and a microphone will come to you and Karl will be able to answer. So. Right down the front here goes
Catherine. Thanks for your speech, Karl. How can the church come together more? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think, I was sitting there last night at the dinner, listening to His Grace Anthony Fisher and thinking, this is a good picture. And so the church is coming together, and I think part of why the church will come together is actually under pressure, where we decide on what we agree on. I think everybody, I don't know anybody in a Christian setting that I've talked to who said, yeah, we should be splintered, that's a great idea. Nobody says that. The problem is, what I love is everybody has these wonderful speeches about working together, and then we'll give you 25 reasons why they can't work with all those different groups. You know, and I think what we need to work out is what is it that we agree on? We agree on the Bible, we agree on the person of Jesus, we agree on making a difference in our community, and sure, there's some small issues that really, I don't think it makes that much difference, but sometimes what happens is that we end up majoring on the minors, and that causes us to splinter. I think we've got to kind of work out exactly where it is we stand, and we need to stand firm on those things. Thank you. The tricky thing will always be deciding what it is. I travel around Australia a fair bit, and this is the problem with too many questions, because I just bang on forever. The interesting going around, Moore College produces great Christian leaders and is a wonderful, wonderful place. In Sydney, it has a reputation for being a little narrow, don't quote that. And the funny thing is I meet Moore College graduates doing work across Australia, and suddenly they end up in another state, another nation, and another state, another capital city where they're a little more liberal across the board. And they suddenly talk to a Pentecostal, and the Pentecostal believes in Jesus and the Bible, and they go, boy, I can work with you. You know, it's kind of, in those places, we sort of get down to what really matters. So I think we've got to focus on the common denominators and work together on the common denominators.
middle at the back there.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, Karl. It's a great start to the day. Do you think we have a tendency to see Christianity through let's say, Western coloured glasses, given the growth of Christianity in Africa and Asia?
Yeah, it's an intriguing. That's an intriguing question. I mean, I think the Christian faith did grow in the West for the majority of its time, and therefore it grew with a kind of culture of the West. There's some interesting writers coming out of the East. I mean, I think it's just a very different space in Africa and Asia and those nations. Now, one of the problems they talk about with Africa is it's like 2 miles wide and half an inch deep. And that may be the case. You've got significant cultural issues about people agreeing, etc. They kind of agree more easily, as it were. That Eastern culture, from my understanding, has a honour-shame culture where you honour the teacher and you believe the teacher. And so you kind of more easily step into new ways of thinking if you believe the teacher. In the West, we are kind of critically minded. And so that we encourage students to kind of critique, etc. I think, lastly, one of the huge issues in the West is that Australia's a great nation, isn't it? What a great place to live. And, people aren't under enormous pressure. And so your life is not at stake every day of the week. And so in the midst of that, how do you make the message of Jesus more relevant when people don't feel like they need anything? And that becomes difficult to share the Christian message in the West.
Just one more, unfortunately. Gentleman over there, yep.
Thank you, Karl. Excellent presentation. I know that we were talking about this last night, but I need to ask the question. We touched on this last night and you touched on it this morning, the need to speak up for the defenceless, for the children, and yet the elephant in the room, I believe, can be sometimes child abuse in the church, and our opposition would throw that at us as being hypocritical. How can you speak up for the defenceless and children when this has occurred? I noticed it's one of the top 10 that you bring out towards belief, and it's probably high up there in the top 10. So my question is, your thoughts on just how much damage that's done for the Christian church to be able to speak up for values and justice, particularly when it comes to children?
It's huge, it's almost like I just want to say yes to that question, because when we did research through McCrindle Research across Australia about what blocks people from Christian faith, 2 of the things that were way up in the top 10 were A, church abuse, and B, hypocrisy. And they are both tightly tied to each other. What has happened, and I don't know, there's a person in the room that wouldn't agree with this statement, is appalling. The point is we have to come out and say it's appalling. We have to demonstrate that we've changed. We have to demonstrate that we're on the side of those who were, for want of a better word, victims. And we have to demonstrate that what we're doing is different. And until we do that, if we don't do that, we will be written off as hypocrites. We deal with this in Towards Belief. It's an apologetic series, but in the end, what we discovered in research is half the problem in the Australian community in looking at questions of faith and belief. Half the problem, yes, is the age-old questions of suffering and can you believe the Bible and is there one way to God? That's all there. But the other half is the church. And apologetics now, we have to speak on behalf of and give an apology for, not say you're sorry, but give an apology for the church. We have a lot to stand for. We can't be just saying, oh, we're hopeless. We're doing wonderful work across the world, but we can't avoid the failings and we need to respond to it.
Look, Karl, just while I've got you on the stage, thanks so much. It's been a really, really great start to the day. When we did the Lachlan Macquarie internship, one of the concepts that we were introduced to was called the golden mean, and it was invented by Aristotle, and it was a reminder that so often we have to find a balance between 2 extremes, and we can fall into that trap so easily. And you've talked about balanced in doctrine, eternity and holiness, grace and love, balanced in our tone, the way we speak, balanced in being contemporary versus popular, and also the fact that we should be calling the church to the Bible and society to human flourishing, I thought was a great takeaway point. So thank you so much for all of that, and just please accept this token of our appreciation. Fabulous. And everybody join me in thanking Karl.